Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're taking a look at Esoteric Enterprises, which is a modern horror role-playing game focused a lot on exploration, created by Emmy Allen of Dying Stylishly Games. This is the physical print edition that was created by Soul Muppet Publishing. As always, links are down in the description below to where you can get the PDF or the print versions for yourself. At the time of recording this, I believe the PDF is actually on sale. We have the back of our book here, basically describing the vibe that the book is going for. It's a dungeon crawl, but it's set underneath the criminal underworld of a city. So you're delving into the tunnels, the catacombs, the weird spaces beneath modern cities, similar to what you would do in a traditional dungeon crawl. Before we start, though, quick shout out to some of our brand new patrons on Patreon, including Chad Vest, Anton Paulison, The Shadow Spawn, Oddmund, Alexander Triffin, Jeff, and John Ewan. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Let's take a look at what we get inside. We have some pretty nice paper quality here. It's quite thick and glossy and sturdy feeling. However, it does appear to be glue bound, which has the disadvantage that when you try and open it, this happens. It really does not want to stay open, and it's quite stiff. You really have to kind of force it down, which does make me worried that I'm going to break the binding or damage it in some way. So I'm kind of careful with it. So that is a downside. We have our table of contents here and a general overview of the occult underground. Now, in terms of the art for the whole book, all of the art is done in photographs that were Creative Commons or free for public use, with some mixed effects. So on the one side, I kind of like how it really gets across the modernness of the game. It feels much more anchored in the real world. On the other side, there are some that feel kind of amateurish and don't really get across the horror or don't get across a particular feel. You are limited in what you can do. So there's some examples there. Some of them I think are quite effective. Like this one's quite nice. Some of them, not so much maybe. So generally we have the occult underground, the undercity, where you're going to be delving to get treasure, just like in traditional D&D. We have some of your enemies like the Men in Black and Paradox Beasts. And then we get some advice for new players, which is really great. If you're into OSR type games, but you have never played one before, this is a great starting point where it really lays out the play style that the whole book is going for. We get right into character creation, and it is very much old school D&D. I'd say it's more Lamentations of the Flame Princess inspired, with some additional things tacked onto it. For example, we have a grit and flesh system, which we've seen in Logan Knight's blog, Last Gasp Grimoire, is used here. I think Emmy has used that before in games like Wolf Packs and Winter Snow. The general idea here is that instead of having just one big pool of hit points that slowly get whittled down, what you do is you have a pool of grit points, which functions more like traditional hit points, but then a separate pool that is flesh, which is more body points. So when you're in combat, your grit will get degraded, but then it can regenerate very quickly. However, your flesh represents actual meat damage, and that is a much... once your grit runs out, then it starts hitting your flesh, and that is much more dangerous to get hit, because that does not regenerate as fast. And that can lead to some really gruesome wounds. We have some more classes here, like bodyguards. Bodyguards basically are the tough ones. They get a lot more hit points. They can soak damage. Criminals are a bit like your thieves. They get some pretty good saves. They get lots of skill points. We have doctors. They're to heal up your party. I guess they're a bit like clerics. You have your explorers, who are great at stealthing and sneaking around, if you like that playstyle. We have mercenaries. These are your fighters. So they are the only ones that get a to hit bonus, similar to what we see in LOTFP. We have mystics. These are more like your traditional clerics in terms of spell casting. So they have a connection to the divine, and they use that for their magic. And we have occultists, which are more like traditional wizards. They actually have to memorize spells, and they have grimoires that they lug around with them. We have a chart here for the number of spells an occultist can memorize at one time. Lastly, we have Spooks. Spooks being any sort of supernatural creature that you might want to create. The system for building those is quite nice. It'll get into more detail on that later on in the book. And we'll look at all the ways that you can cobble together your own particular monsters. So what this book does quite nicely is that although it is mostly about delving in underground ruins and looking for treasure and dealing with whatever monsters and hazards are down there, the book is absolutely packed with tools basically for running modern horror games. So anything from X-Files to Supernatural or Hellboy, I think could be simulated very well using these rules. It really isn't so much about the rules, it's about the content. And the book does give you a lot of content to use. We have some equipment lists here. Some grimoires that you might find at the beginning of the game. And I love this page. So how do I play as a... So when you're playing a sort of modern horror supernatural game, someone's going to want to say, oh, I want to be a necromancer, or I want to be a cop, or I want to be a middling kid, or I want to be a righteous warrior of good. So these are just common stereotypes that don't necessarily match one of the classes. And Emmy here gives very concrete information as to how you can build that type of character using the tools that are in the book. So that's going to be great for new DMs who are definitely going to get these questions. We have some tables to flesh out the PCs. This is great. Lots of random tables to get even more details. And we start getting into the base rules. Now, before we go any further, one thing that did bother me while reading this was the layout. This is a problem for me. The layout is good in the sense that there is a control panel aesthetic going on here where rules are kept to 1 or 2 pages, so you don't have to do a lot of flipping. That's really nice. However, the way that the paragraphs are laid out really bothers me. I don't know if this is just me. So the paragraphs don't have indenting and they don't have any space between 2 paragraphs. So everything is just one giant block of text on each side, which is not a lot of fun to read. I feel like that could be improved a lot. Also, everything is justified, which means that you occasionally get lines with a lot of big gaps in between the words as it kind of stretches them out because no hyphenation is used. It's things like that that are, I guess, quibbles, but they do bother me. And in some cases, they're more obvious than others, but it seems like an issue that would be relatively easy to fix. So it's just bothersome that it wasn't fixed. Some information on how the skill rolls work. It's all out of a D6. And encumbrance, basically the LOTFP system. I love this picture. This is the giant crystals that were found in a cave in a mine somewhere. We have our system for death and dismemberment, which is horrible wounds. Once your flesh, your meat points get down to 0 and you start taking spillover damage, the more spillover damage you take from that hit, the more horrible your wound's going to be. And I love how it is divided up into different types. So you get ballistic wounds, ripping wounds, bludgeoning, shocking, burning, toxic, and so on. So the type of damage can give you all sorts of flavorful, horrible injuries. So toxic wounds, for example, when you start really getting bad, this means you're going to die. There's just too much nasty stuff in your body and you can't cope. You're a dead man walking. We have some things that are a bit more dramatic, like 8 damage on a burning wound. This is brutal. Your skin is basically gone and your body is covered in horrific burns. Or you're dead and the corpse is burnt to oblivion. Or even something minor, like it messes up your eyes or your mouth or your tongue, or it damages your throat so you can't breathe properly. You're going to end up with effects that are going to live with your character for a long time. We have lots of rules and just general advice, not so much rules, on how to handle different kinds of hazards, narcotics, poisons, sicknesses, sleep deprivation, and so on. Running encounters in combat. It's pretty standard D&D combat. If you've run that before, it's going to be pretty familiar with all your standard OSR rules like morale, fleeing in pursuits. Some information here on how to run cache and downtime. So you have your quality of life, which is a pretty good way to summarize this if you don't want to track just individual cash or dollars one at a time. So you have your resource levels going anywhere from destitute, poor, improving, secure, comfortable, all the way up to luxurious or obscene. So you have like these budgets underneath them. That's basically how much money you could spend without even noticing it, which is nice to have that as a rule of thumb when you're making any kind of purchase. They seem more or less on target. They seem to get more off target the further you go up here. For example, someone with an obscene wealth is a character This character is wealthy, is one of the upper crust of society. They move in the same circles as business CEOs and aristocrats, etc. $5,000 budget. That seems a bit low to me. If you're like a billionaire, you're going to be able to spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars without even noticing it. But I think it keeps it down just so that the campaign stays a little more manageable. Medical experiments. You're going to have mad doctors. You can play a mad doctor. And so there's some advice on how to do that. Spooks and their powers. So we have some basic types here. Fairies, ghosts, constructs. The living, plants, minerals, undead. And some powers that they might get. So here's all their monstrous powers. Now, the system here that I really liked was that each of these powers has their own themes, usually more than one theme. And as you level up as a spook, you can gain more of these powers. But whenever you gain a power, it has to have, its themes have to match at least one theme that you've had before. So as you level up, you can really start branching out into new kinds of powers, because since they have multiple tags, this is going to allow you to branch out further and further as you go. But it's going to prevent you from making really discordant monsters with just a grab bag of powers that don't fit together. That is a nice and simple way of handling that, I think. You get all sorts of classic things, anywhere from mesmerizing gazes to screams, to being a poltergeist, to having venom, shooting webs. General spellcasting rules. Occultist spells are going to be your wizard spells. You have a spell book, so you have rules for making scrolls and experimenting. Mystic spells are more like blessings that you get from your god. You have to use your charm abilities to convince your god to allow you to use their powers. And you can bless other people by bestowing spells upon them that they can use. I like that touch. We have a bunch of cults that you're going to have to deal with or possibly join. And we start getting into the really intense random tables. And there are a lot of these throughout the book, and I think it is the main utility that the book provides. So all sorts of mostly bad effects that could happen to you when you unleash magic, both the arcane or the mystic, and things go wrong. The fickle whims of the divine, the cost of holiness. And we start getting to our spell list here. So spells go from rank 1 all the way up to rank 8, as opposed to rank 9, which we typically see in D&D. And a lot of them are D&D spells that have been kind of rethemed, but you certainly get new stuff that is both has an enhanced theme or feels a bit more flavorful, or has been adapted to the modern world. One of my favorite ones from later on, let's see, go to rank 8, for example, is the anti-technology shell, sort of the reverse of the anti-magic shell. So it's a globe of force that shuts down all technology around you. Right after this, we get an introduction to running RPGs. This is basically your DM advice. And it does a really great job at summarizing a lot of your basic D&D advice and getting it out there for players that are fairly new to this and need a handle on what you should be thinking about as a DM. Section on running combat, making things realistic, keeping things visceral and immersive so players feel like they're actually there. This is definitely not a storytelling game in which the idea is to present a plot or a story arc. It's about exploration. So it's about presenting an environment full of dangerous threats and then allowing the player's ingenuity and creativity to take over from there and seeing what happens. And because it is a horror campaign, it actually has some really solid advice on dealing with dark themes and ways that you can communicate with your players to make sure that everyone's having a good time. How to create some new characters. We have a reputation system. Since you are basically criminal weirdos traveling around in the underworld of your modern day city, encounters with law enforcement and with the FBI and, of course, the Men in Black are going to become more and more prevalent. There's also a lot of different factions in here, and your reputation with those factions can increase or decrease. So there's a whole system for tracking that, which adds a whole lot of politics to this type of game. This makes it a little bit more like the sort of thing that you would see with the Vampire the Masquerade type games, where faction manipulation is a bigger deal. And I like that because it adds more long-term problems for the players to have to think about. It can be anything from making enemies less likely to attack you when you see them if you're in the same faction, to them actively helping you when you run into them. We have advice on running heists here. I really like that it's very terse and succinct and useful. So here's some general places that you would want to pull off a heist at, right? A bank, a mob boss's house, a museum, a skilled magician's house, and it has the typical obstacles that you're going to have to deal with. So this gets the players thinking about how they're going to neutralize these things. And busting someone out of Men in Black custody is the worst, of course. Virtually impossible. Rumors and events that you can pull out to make the underworld feel more alive. Shifts in the web of power as factions take territory from one another and their abilities and their influence fluctuate. Hazards of the undercity, so things you can run into while city crawling or dungeon crawling. Gases, spores, slimes, different types of water, sicknesses. There's definitely inspiration here from Veins of the Earth in terms of the focus on crawling through caverns and weird spaces underground. The general world building here is that it's more or less modern day, but of course magic does exist in this secret underground. The premise that the book assumes is that most normal people aren't really aware of this, but it's not exactly super secret. If you delve onto the dark web, you will find grimoires. You can buy spell books on the black market, and a lot of law enforcement is aware that these things exist and are trying to clamp down on it as much as possible. So we have some treasure tables here, including occult treasures that you can score. Some huge I search the body tables that are broken down by the kind of person that you're searching, which is really great because it's not going to be the same for every person. Some magic weapons that you can pull out. Random grimoires. Here we have 100 of them, all with a nice description and a cool name. Some of these are real things, like the Voynich manuscript, but other of these are probably made up. But it gives you basically an unending supply of weird books for the players to discover, which really fits with the theme. Some specific magic items if you want to get more concrete and don't just want to give them, +1 guns or whatever. And we get to the part of rolling up the undercity. So this seems to be heavily inspired by Logan Knight's Last Gasp Grimoire as well, where the idea here is that you are taking handfuls of dice and dropping them on a piece of paper, and the location of the dice, the numbers that they're rolling, and the type of dice are all going to affect what those things are. It basically generates a map, because each of those dice is a location, and you draw connections between them, and then you end up with an undercity. So we have the different types that you can get here, right? Connecting tunnels. These, the tunnel that you get between two locations depends on the dice that are on either end. And we have some complexes in the undercity that are all get further details here. Many of these also have random tables on top of those to even further randomize them, so that your undercity city crawls or tunnel crawls, I'm not sure what the right term is, are going to be different every time. Limestone caverns, sewer clusters, cult strongholds, gang strongholds, bomb shelters, underworld frontiers, buried ruins, church crypts, historic tombs, landfill pits, abandoned mines, embassies of the lithic courts. That's very Veins of the Earth. Some of the weird creatures that crawl up from deep, deep underground and have their own embassies that you can deal with. Serpent folk ruins. So much information, and with tons of concrete gameable details that you can put into your game to add variety and interest and things for the players to interact with. Underworld factions. So we have ways that not only can you use this technique of dropping dice to create locations and how they're connected, you can do the same technique to generate a whole bunch of factions and how they're connected, which is really clever. I'd never thought of doing that, but the basic technique is exactly the same. Militant cults, necromantic circles, Morlock packs. You can figure out who's allied with who, who's more powerful than who's hunting who. And we have lots of encounter tables, all broken up based on the environment that you're in. This is a toolkit, which is why I say that it would work so well in lots of different types of games, even if you're not dungeon crawling. It's a great resource book for any sort of modern horror. We have law enforcement all the way up to Men in Black, which are broken into Men in Black Field Agents, Men in Black Paladins, and Men in Black Abominations, which get more and more eldritch horror-y the further up that you go. There's definitely some SCP influence in this book in terms of weird anomalies that you would find. We start getting into a monster manual of sorts: career criminals, mundane civilians, occult weirdos, lots of different types of those, including slashers, altered medics, flesh crafters, post-humans, Prometheans. We have lots of cults with their patrons, the spell list that they have, associated monsters, and symbols. Huge variety there. Plenty of undead monsters, of course, that you're going to run into. Artificial constructs, maintenance golems, stone guardians, ghostly things, fairy courts, fairy nobles, and lots of random tables for generating those nobles. Lycanthropes, vampire broods, animals, chimerical monstrosities, bugs, weirdness inhabiting the undercity, oozes, plant monsters. So this is a quite substantial monster manual that's going to cover most things that you would want to the players to run into. Morlocks, troglodytes, aboleths, and paradox beasts, which are the weird creatures generated when magic goes awry. We have an Appendix N with media, so some of the games this was inspired by include things like D&D, of course, LOTFP, Call of Cthulhu, and some other RPGs like Vampire the Masquerade, Last Gasp Grimoire, and Veins of the Earth, of course. So it's great to see those things called out. We have a section at the back on compatibility, which is quite nice. So if you're running any sort of OSR or D&D-like system, this book's going to be pretty easy to use with whatever you have in there already. But if you have any questions about compatibility, this will help you out. And there we have it. So that is Esoteric Enterprises. I do have some quibbles with it. My quibbles are mostly about the physical construction. The book is, while the pages are quite substantial, the binding is very stiff and glue bound, and it's not a lot of fun to hold open and read as a result, because it feels like it's always resisting you. And I feel like the layout could have been improved with some better fonts and spacing and typography. However, the real selling point of this is, of course, the content. The huge number of random tables and useful things to throw into any sort of modern horror game. Basically, no matter what sort of game you're running in a modern horror or fantastic setting, the materials in here are going to be useful. So the PDF would be fantastic for that, even if for nothing else. And then, of course, you have the rules on top of that. The systems for generating factions and the connections and randomly creating dungeon crawls underground is really excellent and exciting. It's fun to just throw dice at a page and then link everything up and just see what it creates for you and then tweak it to your heart's content. So as usual, links are in the description below for where you can pick this up in PDF or in print form. And thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.